This story is told on behalf of a girl. Almost a year, I haven't been in those places after the death of my beloved grandmother. The last time I crossed the threshold of her house was on September 20th, last year, just the day of her funeral. All the village gathered there. As I remember it now, grandmother was known by everybody and was known as a very good, kind, and sympathetic person. It so happened that I became an orphan in my early childhood, and the only real family member was my grandmother. I don't remember my parents. Only when I grew up, my grandmother grudgingly told me about my drunken father, who went to heaven when I was 2 years old. She found him at the end of the garden, under a cherry tree in blossom. She never told me the cause of death, and I wasn't interested in knowing all the details. Mom left us shortly after my late father began to drink, found another suitor, and went to live abroad with him, not wanting to take a small child with her. Only my grandmother was able to bring me up. All my conscious life, I lived in the countryside. I went to school there, and all my friends lived next to me, just across the street from our house. I grew up a perfectly normal kid. I had everything I needed. Only sometimes when I saw my friends in the yard with their moms and dads, I asked my grandmother questions, but she didn't want to answer them. Apparently, not to traumatize the shaky psyche of a small child. And as I grew older, as my brain began to work a little better, my grandmother told me what I had said a little earlier. Soon, I went to university, and I had to leave home and move into a dormitory, as there was no opportunity to get from the village to the city every day, and besides, the distance was decent. So we lived. Every weekend I came to our house, where the dearest and closest person, delicious food, and heart-to-heart talks till dawn were always waiting for me. I felt great there, but as people say, good things come in small packages. In about 3 weeks, maybe a little less, I began to notice that my grandmother was slowly fading. I couldn't feel her energy anymore. At first, I tried to justify it by the fact that she is a human and also gets tired. After all, the years go by. She was already an old woman. I had no idea in those days what was really starting to happen. I came home for the weekend shortly before she died. I couldn't make it to the morning train, as I had been studying classes until nightfall and overslept, so I had to take the evening train. Outside the train windows, it was unbearably hot, and in the carriage even more so. The sweat was literally dripping from me. Also, someone was sitting in front of me and eating a smelly fish, the stench of which spread throughout the carriage and caused an overwhelming desire to leave the train as quickly as possible. I rode, looking at the tall pines flying past, and madly looking forward to seeing my grandmother. It was Saturday. As usual on that day, all the village's young people gather at our local nightclub, listening to music loudly, drinking and laughing. I think many of you have already imagined this picture. This phenomenon has become a kind of tradition, and people don't really mind. But what else should guys and girls do during the warm summer nights? And they often took me to their place. Probably they'll be tempting me today too, I thought to myself as I drove up to the platform. No, I'm not going anywhere. I miss my grandmother very much. I'll stay with her tonight. It was that night I realized that something was wrong. When I opened the door, I saw Grandma sitting at the table in the kitchen. "Hi, Grandma," I shouted as usual. Usually, Granny would meet me at the gate, but today she hadn't even come out of the house. I ran up to her and hugged her tightly without even taking my shoes off. "How are you, Grandma?" I asked, puzzled, staring at her. Grandmother was sitting in a nightgown, drinking a cold tea, and as if sharply came to life, she answered,
"Hello, my dear. Why did I completely forget that you were coming today? God, I didn't even cook anything."
Oh, come on, Grandma. I smiled. I'm not hungry. I had a pastry on the platform back in town.
"Oh, there are such pastries that it is better not to eat them, unless, of course, you want to spend the night in the toilet."
Smiling, answered Grandma. How are you doing here, Granny? Taking off my backpack, I asked.
"Oh, Christy,"
she sighed. What happened?
"Nothing. Everything is fine."
Grandma, do I look like a person who doesn't understand anything? Suddenly, she called me with her finger and in a half voice said,
"Christy, put the kettle on and sit down next to me."
I put the water boiling and we sat down on the couch.
"I feel bad lately."
What's the matter? Does anything hurt?
"I don't seem to be in any pain, but I'm feeling a little weak."
Should I call a doctor?
"I'm afraid a doctor won't help. Something tells me it's not about my health."
What's the problem? I asked, puzzled, and for some reason, at once in my head like a sharp nail, hammered the story of my grandmother on how my father died. Call it what you want, but the conversation that followed was about him. When I first heard my grandmother's story a few years ago, I somehow knew that there was something of an understatement. My grandmother poured sugar into the cup and continued.
"The cattle in the village began to go missing since Monday, this week in particular. First, someone stole chickens. Natalie, who lives across the street, had 5 of them stolen, and there's no trace of them anywhere. You know her. She caused a panic in the whole village, and after her loss, people began to count their own cattle, and as it turned out, there were 5 more missing."
Maybe there was a thief.
"Listen to the rest of the story, and then interrupt your grandmother. Tuesday, nothing like that happened, and on Wednesday, some piglets went missing from Mr. Hirst at the end of the street. Do you remember him?"
Yes, I do.
"And you know, not a trace of them, as if they had vanished into thin air. And in the following days, the cattle disappeared again. All the goats were taken away from another neighbor. Just the day before yesterday, the men gathered and made an ambush, armed as they could, and guarded the whole night. They walked around the village, trying to find the thief and to punish him."
Grandma sighed heavily again.
"I went out to the toilet that night.
We have a toilet outdoors, right next to the house.
I looked, and at the end of the garden, there was a pile. I went there and almost stopped my heart. For God's sake."
Grandma crossed her heart and bowed to the icon in the corner of the room.
"And in the pile, there were chickens, pigs, and goat bones. It was all chewed up and smelled so bad, it made my eyes peck out."
I involuntarily got goosebumps.
"And the most interesting thing is that the rest of the animal was rotted. I understand that it was hot, but it can't all rot to the bone in 3 or 4 days."
It can't, I muttered. Suddenly, my grandmother leaned over to me and whispered,
"And that pile was right where I found your father dead."
You think it had something to do with it?
"I'm not sure. The next day, all the people kept away from our house. I stood there, but I didn't understand anything. I tried to tell people what I had found, tried to find out what was going on, but no one wanted to listen to me, except Mr. Hirst, who told me who they saw that night when they were guarding the thief."
Who?
"Your father, Paul."
What? My father? He's dead.
"He said that they went in the direction of the field. Well, at the end of the street. We were standing," he said, "smoking with the guys, and then suddenly about 50 feet away, the eyes shone. Simon, the store owner, responded quickly, turned on a flashlight, and a beam of light highlighted your son from the darkness. It was so scary that a bunch of big men ran away in fear like children."
Mr. Hirsch said Paul had a chicken in his teeth, standing and growling like a beast. He was pale as paper, dirty, thin, and whitish eyes, such that they couldn't see his pupils at all. How could they see him if he's dead, Grandma?
I don't know, but everyone says it was him. He was well known in the village, and I don't doubt the words of the neighbors.
This is some kind of devilry. I could hardly believe my grandmother's story, and I even considered the possibility that she was dreaming. But when we went out to the vegetable garden, and she showed me that pile of leftover livestock, I had to wonder if the story was true. We went into the house and sat down in the kitchen again. It was already pitch black outside the window, and not a single star in the sky was visible, nor was the noisy company I was so used to outside our store. The windows were unlit, and there was not a living soul at the makeshift tables. Grandma was very anxious, and I would even say frightened. Pouring another mug of tea, she continued,
And last night, I even saw someone running outside the window. It must have been Paul.
I looked at her and noticed a tear on her cheek. Grandma, why are you so upset? I tried to comfort her, though I also felt uncomfortable with her words.
I told him, when he was alive, not to go to that bitch.
It was the first time I heard such words from my grandmother. Who are you talking about?
She used to live on the outskirts of the village, making moonshine and selling it to drunks like your daddy. People say she's dealing with the evil one.
What do you mean? Do you think she did it? Then why did it take so long for all this to start happening? It's been years, Grandma.
I don't know, and I don't want to know why he showed up now.
Had he ever come before?
Maybe he had, or maybe not. I haven't seen him. Well, Christy, let's go to sleep. It's almost morning, and tomorrow I'll need your help.
We made the bed and went to sleep. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. I kept replaying my grandmother's story in my head, thinking it up, building some theories that didn't add up anyway. Well, it can't be true. Or maybe there really is something like that. I don't understand. In the morning, my eyes finally closed, and I was about to fall asleep when I noticed a silhouette outside the window. But since I was already dreaming, I didn't pay any attention to it, and probably it was for the best. The next day passed in the usual domestic chores. Only grandmother wasn't feeling well since the morning, so I did all the housework myself. She only kept a warm conversation. No one recalled the night's talk, although we were both still thinking about it. The next week, my grandmother passed away. My neighbor called me while I was sitting in class, and she told me the hard news. The tears involuntarily began to flow from my eyes, and I barely had time to wipe them. Without saying anything to the teacher, I took my stuff and went to the train station and thence to the village. On the same day, my neighbor told me that she went out to the vegetable garden in the morning to pick strawberries. She looked, and at the end of our vegetable garden, she noticed my grandmother among the remains of a pile of dead cattle. Over the weekend, we cleaned it up as best we could, but not completely. The district officer and his assistant walked around the house, and half of the village ran to the yard. I had the impression from observing the scene that someone had dragged her out of the house and into the back of the garden. The broken vegetation and the marks on the ground clearly indicated that. My grandmother wore nothing but a nightgown, all covered in either blood or some other dark substance, and the corpse itself was frozen in some strange posture. It was as if she was trying to fight something off. The expression on her face was the same. I was alone in the world, and this made me feel very bad. Tears were pouring out of my eyes, and I couldn't do anything about it. The funeral was held the day after she died. As I said at the beginning of the story, a lot of people gathered there, and among the crowd standing next to the coffin, I heard strange words. I never understood who said them, but they frightened me, and frightened me quite a lot.
I guess Paul was here again, but she couldn't get away from him this time.
Another woman's voice answered.
So he got his revenge on his mother.
Yeah, God rest her soul.
Yes, it's a pity. She was a good person, always ready to help, to give advice and support.
But how could he come? He'd been dead for 10 years.
There was a third voice in the crowd.
He used to visit Sarah, the moonshiner. I think they even had some sort of relationship there.
Jesus Christ. She's a real witch, isn't she?
She didn't want her son to go there. They argued a lot back then, even fought so much that it was heard across the village.
And why didn't he come before? It's been a long time.
I couldn't stand it, so I went over to the conversations.
Nobody knows. We only know that your grandmother kicked him out of the house after another argument and a stolen pension. So he left, shouting at the top of his voice that he would kill your grandmother. And in the end, the next morning he was found dead. Either he was burned by moonshine, or it's something else. It's a vague story, and it's not clear at all.
Slowly, everything began to make a logical chain. But why? After so many years? The question was the only link that was missing. My grandmother was buried, and not wanting to stay in that house alone, I packed everything I needed, locked all the doors, and left for the city. It was incredibly difficult for me at the time. My closest and dearest person had died, and under such strange and mysterious circumstances that I couldn't believe it. Time passed its course. For a long time, I was very unaccustomed to being without her, but time has put everything in its place. Slowly, those horrible days began to be forgotten. I was completely absorbed in my studies and work, but sometimes before I went to sleep, I thought of my grandmother, recalled our warm conversations in the evening. These memories repeatedly made me cry, but I didn't want to go back to that house, at least that time. For almost a year, I wasn't there after the death of my beloved grandmother. The last time I crossed the threshold of her house was on September 20th last year. When I finished my studies, I began to think about a permanent place of residence. I had no desire or opportunity to live in the countryside. After all, this is the middle of nowhere with no prospects. Old people are already living out their years there, and all the young people left a long time ago. In fact, much has changed during the year that I was away, and our house has changed too. So I decided to sell it and buy something smaller. But in the city, I had to go to the countryside. Once again, the railway station, ticket offices, dirty train, and age-old pines running past the carriages. Many houses were deserted and overgrown with foot-long grass. It became somehow empty, gloomy, gray. Only as I approached the house, I met Mr. Hirst, sitting on a bench, repairing something. "Hello," I smiled.
Hello, Christy. We haven't seen you for a long time. Still, I understand you. There's nothing to do in this hellhole.
"You are right," I smiled again.
How long are you staying?
3 days at least.
Well, if you feel like it, come by, and we'll have a small talk.
"Certainly, Mr. Hirst." Our house was also overgrown with grass, and in some places, with moss. I snuck through the thickets and put the key in the old keyhole. Stepping inside brought back memories of the comfort of the place, but there was no comfort anymore. Everything was covered with an inch layer of dust. Cobwebs were hanging everywhere, and it smelled musty and damp. I had the task of getting the house in order and selling it as quickly as possible, though I could hardly believe anyone would buy it here. But I wanted ridiculous money for it too. All day, I was engaged in cleaning, wiping dust, sweeping, tearing up the grass in the yard, that it was possible at least to get to the terrace. And finally, by evening, the picture was more or less acceptable. The house was filled with comfort and warmth. At one point, I even lost the urge to sell it. Tomorrow, I would have to ask Mr. Hirst to do something with the walls and to paint the window frames. Terribly tired, I made myself some tea, took the phone, and went into the bedroom. Outside the window, there was already impenetrable darkness. Even the streetlights, which were always lit in the evening, weren't working this time. The nightmare had already begun that night. I hadn't even time to finish my tea before I began to fall asleep. I was insanely tired. I put the cup on the nightstand, and only after touching the pillow, my eyes closed. Suddenly, I woke up in a cold sweat. I sharply lifted my head from the pillow and stared into the darkness with my eyes wide open. I woke up in the second hour of the morning with what I thought was a groundless fear. Maybe I was dreaming, I thought. No, I would have remembered. That's weird. I was terribly dry in the mouth, as if I had been at a good party yesterday, and getting out of bed, I went to the kitchen to drink water, and suddenly, my attention was attracted by some movement outside the window. I stared there, and at the same moment, I remembered that night at my grandmother's when I was falling asleep. I also saw someone running outside the window, and I didn't pay any attention to it. Now, I knew it didn't seem to me, neither then nor now. There really was someone there, and in my heart, I probably understood who it was. Even then, I had the urge to pack up and get out of the house as quickly as possible. In order not to make any unnecessary sound, I slowly began to dress and gather things in my bag. I stood, unbuttoning my backpack, and heard more clearly the footsteps outside the window. That's just natural someone walking. I accelerated and went back into the bedroom to pick up the charger from the phone, and numbed, I stood in the aisle, and on the bed where I had slept a few minutes before, someone was lying. An animal horror enveloped me in its vile and sticky chains. My arms and legs began to gradually go numb, and it seemed as if the blood was actually congealing in my veins. Suddenly, whoever was lying on the bed moved. An arm came out of nowhere from under the blanket. It was blue and wrinkled white skin, swollen fingers, and yellow split fingernails. There was a crunching sound across the room, as if someone had snapped in half under the blanket, and the next moment was the scariest thing I'd seen in my not-so-long life. Suddenly, the same hand threw off the blanket, and I recognized the same nightgown in which my grandmother had been found. The same, dirty, drenched in the soil, stained with blood. It was her. It was my grandmother. But how did she end up in bed? There was no one at home. All the doors were locked, and she was lying in a cemetery a few miles away from the village. Suddenly, she got out of bed. Her face was the same color as her hands, and in some places, her body had already begun to rot, with worms clearly visible. She sat down on the bed, covered in corpse stains. I stood in the doorway the whole time, unable to move a single finger.
Hey, why don't you sleep?
Suddenly, I heard her voice, the most horrible and disgusting thing I had ever heard in my life. It was so creepy, it was impossible to put it into words. She sounded as if she was speaking in several different voices at once, but they all merged into a horrible wheezing sound that gave me legions of goosebumps.
Go to sleep, Christy. Daddy will be here in a minute. You must have missed him.
I stood there and thought to myself, Dad was probably just outside the house. I finally pulled myself together, realizing that if my father came here, I would definitely not be safe. Then, I ran outdoors in what I was wearing and only took my cell phone. After opening the gate, I rushed as fast as I had never run in my life. Luckily, Mr. Hirst's light was on, and after jumping over his fence, I looked back. My father, who had died more than 10 years ago, had been chasing me all this time, just as he had been described by the men who had ambushed the cattle thief a year before. He didn't keep up with me and stopped 5 feet from Mr. Hirst's gate. The neighbor in turn opened the door, and I flew into his house without saying anything. He didn't even ask me anything. On the contrary, he began to answer my questions. which had piled up a lot. To make a long story short, I will only tell you what our neighbor told me. As it turned out this year, one detail became clear. As I said before, my late father went to see a woman. My grandmother was adamantly opposed to him being with her, and one night, she snuck into her yard and set fire to her house. My grandmother, she set the house on fire. That woman survived, but she was crippled for life. There was talk in the village that when she got involved with the evil one in order to survive and get revenge, and she got her revenge, she cursed our whole family for several generations to come. First, the curse hit my father, and he didn't die from drinking. But why so many years later did my grandmother die?
Because she had somehow managed to evade the curse the whole time, but eventually it got to her.
And it would have gotten to me if I hadn't run away.
My advice to you is, you can stay with me till morning, then get your things, and get out of here. Never come back. You won't sell this house, believe me. I wouldn't buy a place with dead people walking around at night.
I listened to my neighbor, and in the morning, I was on my way back to town, and the house was still standing there, overgrown with grass and moss.